Welcome! In this talk we're going to be discussing invertebrate diversity and general characteristics of invertebrates. So invertebrates actually make up between 90 and 90% of all animals. And if you think about this is actually quite astounding considering we don't typically always have invertebrates come to the forefront of our brain when we're thinking about animals. And the largest group of all these organisms is going to be the insects. So because of this, it's a good idea to have a good handle on some of the characteristics of these organisms. Invertebrates, if we take a look at the phylogenetic order, oftentimes, by the way, in order to remember how this goes, you can use the phrase King Philip came over for good soup to see how they are kind of classified or organized within the grouping of organisms. So they fall within the domain of Eukarya and within the kingdom of Animalia. So generally, animals have several shared characteristics. First, they are multicellular eukaryotic organisms. So we no longer have any of these examples of single-cell organisms, and we also don't have any prokaryotic organisms, although that really just was in our bacteria and archaea domains. They are all heterotrophs, so they all have to eat or ingest food in some way. And the haploid stage that we saw in existence with organisms such as plants is not going to be something that manifests into an exterior organism. We now only have an egg and a sperm that are the haploid cells, and beyond that it's going to be just simply a eukaryotic organism. And just to give you an idea of that, in our little example here with the sea star, the haploid stage, where there's only half the genetic material, is only really happening in this egg and sperm elements that are found for the organism. Now we do find in invertebrates that they can actually release egg and sperm. They can release that into the outside of their body, so there's a survival element of that particular type of cell outside of the body, which we don't see in more complex organisms like humans. But it is going to be the only part in which there's going to be a single cell. And from there, the zygote, or the fertilized egg, goes through a series of mitosis and eventually manifests into this adult stage. That, in comparison to our algae life cycle, by the way, where we had a whole structure that was formed within this haploid stage, and that gave rise to gametes, which were then fused in order to make the diploid stage, or the full complement of genetic material. So a little bit different here. In terms of the evolution of animals, there's a few key points within history that we can kind of link to help us understand the progress of some of these developments evolutionarily. First, around 575 to 550 million years ago, we had the oldest, or were documented the oldest known animal fossils. Within the period of 535 or so to 525 million years ago was something called the Cambrian explosion. This basically refers to a very diverse group of animals that were able to occupy or take over small little niches that were previously unoccupied. There was environmental changes to the earth that contributed to this explosion that made it more possible or more accommodating to the physiological structures of organisms at that time. And then there were changes in regulatory genes that allowed for large organisms to be larger. So quite a few things happening, or it's hypothesized as happening during that Cambrian period, with some obviously fossil and other evidence. There are two groups of animals. They can be broken into a group called invertebrates, which we're talking about today, and vertebrates. The word vertebrae refers to backbone, so invertebrates, that little prefix in is corresponding to the word no, which means that these organisms are going to have no backbone. And as you can see on the right-hand side, we kind of have a breakdown beyond that into the different groups of organisms, which we'll run through now. So when you're categorizing invertebrates. And when you're organizing them into groups, there's several different features that you can use to do that. First, we have something called symmetry, and there's different types of symmetry. There's a type of symmetry called radial symmetry, as in the figure to the left with the sea anemone, where you're going to find the same kind of elements or parts to that organisms in each of those quadrants. So there's not a different type of physiological structure or internal element that's going to be different within those. It's all just kind of divided evenly amongst the organism in that radial format. The other major type of symmetry is called bilateral symmetry, as in the lobster over to the right-hand side. And here you really have two symmetrical or reflective elements. You'll have the same structures on either side if you were to split that lobster down the middle. And we do find that there's different structures at the front versus the end, which we will talk about in a second. Another couple things to note is that the top of the lobster is referred to as the dorsal side, the bottom is referred to as the ventral side, and we can use this when we're discussing different structures of the organisms. So another element that's unique is the embryonic tissue development. We have something called Protostome versus Deuterostome. And essentially, it has to do with different types of tissue layers. So when an organism is forming, there's this process of gastrulation, which is where the first opening in an embryo is going to be formed. So in some animals, such as in the top example here, there's an inner endoderm kind of layer as well as an outer ectoderm layer, and that is only going to, it's going to be quite simplistic here, and it's also going to be pretty straightforward forward in terms of what is developing in that kind of pore. So these two layers for some animals are going to be just kind of simplistic. When we get down to the three layers where we have the ectoderm, the endoderm, and something called mesoderm, which are these little bits of tissue that exist in between those two layers and sometimes interspersing it, we either find organisms that have a protostome, or the mouth structure that develops first, or a deuterostome, which is the anus that's going to develop first. Now, obviously with full and complete, not incomplete, but complete digestive systems, there eventually will be the full development of that particular structure. So the embryonic tissue development really just refers to what part is developing first in the organism in that future kind of digestive tract. So interesting. It's not all the same. There's also several different types of body cavities. We have an acollimate, which is going to be a body cavity that does not have any of this interstitial fluid. It is just going to have a tissue-filled region as well as the digestive sac. So it kind of corresponds again to that digestive tract and how that's structured. But tissue and an exterior tissue, and then the structure for digestion. In pseudocollimates, you have a fluid-filled area that surrounds the digestive tract, and then several different types of tissue surrounding that interstitial fluid, or inner tissue fluid, I guess. And then a full collimate is going to be an organism that has tissue layers that are suspending the internal organisms there. And there's going to be column, or this fluid-filled structure that goes in between these. So it's kind of a combination of a separate, more rigid and structured tissue that's supported by that column, or that fluid section, but is also going to be separate from the exterior kind of tissues for the organism. So getting into the different types of organisms. Now, we won't step through each of those structures, but just keep in your mind that we're going from more of the simplistic organisms to more of the complex organisms, and we'll kind of touch on their digestive tract and this, that, and the other, and when we get to these more complex stages. So first off, we have 8 different groups of organisms. We begin with the phylum Porifera, which are sponges. such as in these beautiful pictures here. These are going to be the most simplistic of animals. They have no nerves or cells, or nerve cells, I should say nerve cells. They are going to have no body symmetry to them as well. So I mentioned two forms of body symmetry. There's actually another which would be termed or phrased asymmetry, as in the case of these sponges. They also are only going to have 2 layers of cells. The adults are going to be sessile, so they're going to be stuck in place. They can't move around, although the offsprings or the larvae are going to be able to move around. And they feed off of passing food particles, so they rely on ocean currents in order to acquire their food. The body structure of these organisms are going to be unique in that they just have this open kind of structure, so they will have a pore or a cavity through which water can travel. This basically means that they are going to have a similar, they're not going to regulate any of their internal environment really. It's just going to be similar in temperature, in pH level, and whatever else to the water that surrounds them. So there's a kind of consistent and persistent water flow through these organisms. They have something called a collar cell, which is represented, or it's also phrased a choanocyte, which is represented by these little structures here with the little cute little arms there. And those collar cells have something called a flagella, which is similar to like a whip-like tail that can be found in either individual organisms like protists or cells. It's this thin little line that's kind of coming out of this little collar cell or choanocyte. And that is going to help sweep water through the body. So that flagella just flaps around in order to keep the water moving. As you can imagine, this is really important for continuing to have, oxygenated water and whatnot pass by these different organisms. They also have something called amoebocytes, which produce supportive skeleton fibers. So that would be represented by these cute little blue structures here. Finally, there's going to be water that's flowed through a pore that's found within the tissue of these organisms. So this little box here is representing a cross-section of the tissue of this particular organism. So very kind of simple and consistent structure to these organisms. That pore is going to help, again, to kind of have water flowing constantly past these organisms. The next group is called Phylum Cnidaria, and this consists of jellyfish, it's a good example, but also sea anemones and corals and hydras. You've got a little example there of an anemone as well as a jellyfish. These are all going to have radial symmetry to them, so the same kind of elements or components in each quadrant, if you were to kind of pizza pie it. And the bodies are going to arise from 2 tissues as well. They are, however, going to have these simple contractile tissues and nerves. So we see a little bit of a difference here because of the fact that they're having these nerves that now present and these contractile fibers that allow them to have a little bit more, not a lot, but a little bit more control into their interaction with the environment. Their body can come in one of 2 different forms. There is the polyp form, which is a cylindrical body with cute little tentacles, such as the hydra over on the left-hand side, or the medusa form, which is more of a umbrella shape that has tentacles spanning out from it. The mouth is going to be under the center of the bell for this jellyfish, and in the center of the cylindrical body for the polyp. And the mouth is going to basically lead directly to the gastrovascular cavity where the food is digested. The food goes in and the waste comes out of the same place, which is interesting. So super simple digestive system. We would actually refer to this as an incomplete digestive system because of the fact that it doesn't have one food going in one side and going out another. So incomplete is what we kind of refer to as that digestive system. And as you can imagine, it's more simplistic. I I forget. I think it has a pseudocolumate to these structures. Yeah, I have to check on that. But the other thing about it is these organisms have something called cnidocytes, which are stinging cells, and they're usually attached to the tentacles, or they are attached to the tentacles, and they help to defend and capture prey, defend the organism and capture prey. Next in our group of invertebrates is Phylum Platyhelminthes, or flatworms. These are super cute little guys. They have a bilateral symmetry to them, so it's the first group of invertebrates where we see this bilateral symmetry. You could cut these little flatworms in half and have the same parts on either side. They have 3 tissue layers as well now, instead of 2, so they have this mesoderm present. And then they have no body cavity, however, so they're not going to have anything more complex than that. They are just going to have this mesoderm structure to it. They have these nervous tissue clusters that are located close to the head, quotation marks, it's not really a head, but the top dorsal and dorsal front part of the organism, and this helps them to see light and dark. There are 3 groups of these platyhelminthe worms. Some of them are free-living flatworms and grow underneath rocks in freshwater ponds and things like that. Some of them are flukes, and they are parasites that live on skin or in the mouth or gills of organisms, such as fish. And then there's also tapeworms, which are a parasitic group that live in the digestive tract of vertebrates. So they're not super fun. They're kind of disgusting. But if you're a worm person, then they're super interesting and cool as well. But they do have these little suckers, hooks and suckers. The hooks help them to kind of attach themselves to wherever they're living, if they are a parasitic one as opposed to any of these versions really would have those hooks. And then the sucker is going to help them in order to digest food. Next we have the phylum Nematoda, or the roundworms. And here we have yet another interesting type of worm. These are going to exhibit bilateral symmetry. They have the 3 tissue layer. But now we have fluid-filled body cavity happening within these roundworms, and their digestive tract is going to be complete. So they're going to have 2 openings, a mouth and an anus. They can be free-living or parasitic. And a good example would be heartworm. If you've ever given your dog or cat heartworm medication, it's a good example of a type of roundworm. It's kind of a disgusting picture, but here you can see they really do they can kind of spread and infect and really thrive within certain environments. I'll move away from that picture. Next we have phylum Mollusca, and as you can see, kind of by the way, we're moving from less complex organisms to more complex organisms. So it's interesting to see how early on in that evolutionary progression, how some of these more advanced characteristics cropped up sooner than perhaps we had thought. We tend to think of the animals we know and love as the ones that are more complex, but actually we see that complexity early on in some of these groups. So Mollusca is going to consist of molluscs, which is I think it's a rather diverse group. It can consist of snails, slugs, oysters, clams, octopus, and squid. Mollusca refers to the Latin word soft, and that's because of the fact that they have a soft foot to them. They have 3 main body parts: a foot for locomotion, a visceral mass, which is their body with organs for all sorts of fun things like digestion and reproduction, and then something called a mantle, which is a fold of tissue that is able to secrete a shell in some of these organisms. Obviously, a sea slug would not have the ability to create the same structure as a snail. These organisms have a structure called a radula, which is basically like a cat tongue. It's got a bunch of little spikes along the radula, which you can equate to a cat tongue, and that allows them to scrape algae, as well as in some predatory snails and whatnot, as well as scrape through the shells of other organisms. They are a little bit more complex than the last group. They have something called an open circulatory system, which is essentially where they have basically somewhat of a vessels for this fluid to move through their body. It's not quite the same as blood, but it's open to the internal environment so that it can kind of move around freely, and it's not restrained to different vessels. The grouping of Mollusca is dependent on specific characteristics. As you can imagine, snails and slugs get lumped into one group that are referred to as gastropods, gastro meaning stomach, pod meaning foot. The clams and oysters get lumped in other things that fall into that same kind of, I guess, characteristics, as you can imagine with clams and oysters, the two shells and whatnot. Falls into a group called bivalves, which means two shell. And then squids and octopus fall into something called cephalopods, which means head foot. So a couple of quite diverse group there. Next we have the Phylum Annelida, next on the complexity scale. And the Phylum Annelida is going to consist of segmented worms. The segmentation really just refers to the subdivision of the body into repeated parts for flexibility. But to be honest, the segmentation is more kind of I think of it more in terms of a macro scale. So at the head of the animal, you're going to have different internal things happening than at the middle and the end. So for example, an earthworm that's found in damp soil, some species are found in the sea and also freshwater environments. They're going to have this internal anatomy that's going to consist of a small, cute little brain here, a body cavity. They're going to have a digestive tract here, a crop and a gizzard located about here, and then just along the inside here is where your things start to mix around and change a bit. There's a bit of reproductive structures that are found in here as well, the gonads. These organisms create both male and female egg and sperm, so they don't necessarily need to find another earthworm in order to reproduce, which is interesting. And then when you get to the second half of the body here, after this structure here, it's all just basically the simple rest of the digestive tract, and then there's just some a nerve cord as well as a blood vessel that's running all the way down there, and that's it. So the bulk of everything is happening in the first third or so of this organism. There's quite a few groups of Annelida. We have the earthworms. It's probably the largest earthworm ever, the giant Australian earthworm, which is crazy, off to the left-hand side. Obviously, we're used to ones that are much smaller than that. There's also polychaetes, which are in the middle there, and polychaetes actually can have venom to them, which is interesting. And then leeches over to the far right-hand side. And I'm sure we've all heard stories of leeches existing in aquatic environments. Next, we have the Phylum Arthropoda, or the arthropods. This is going to consist of, things like, again, another diverse group of crayfish, lobsters, crabs, barnacles, spiders, ticks, and insects. It's going to be considered the most successful phylum, so of that 90 to 97% of organisms that are invertebrates, I think a good chunk of those, maybe 70 to 80%, fall within this phylum. Arthro refers to the word jointed, and pod refers to the word foot. They have an exoskeleton that's made of proteins and something called chitin, which is more of a breathable substance, allows oxygen exchange. And they have something called an open circulatory system as well, so still have that open circulatory system. Just to give you an idea of the types of arthropods, we have chelicerates, which are going to be spiders and mites and things like that we're familiar with on land, but also horseshoe crabs belong to this group of chelicerates. Secondarily, we have millipedes and centipedes, which, and I should mention, a large number of insect or arthropods have colonized land. But we do find quite a few of these varietals within the ocean as well. So there are marine millipedes and centipedes as well. And then crustaceans, which are going to be things like barnacles and crabs and things like that. The chelicerates have claw-like feeding appendages and no antenna. The centipede is going to have this poisonous claw to them, and the crustaceans are going to be mostly aquatic, unlike the other two groups. So with the insects, they undergo something really interesting, which is I should say with a large number of these, no, I guess it's just insects. They undergo this metamorphosis. And I should mention this is actually true of some of the organisms within the marine environment too. It's not just insects. But in the metamorphosis process, the larvae is going to have a different form than the adult. So we find this a lot with when you're talking about phytoplankton, or sorry, not phytoplankton, zooplankton floating around in the water. A lot of that will consist of the larvae component of these different invertebrates. So they are going to have different foods. There's going to be an adult that emerges after a non-feeding pupa, but in the ocean that'll be a little bit different. There's also incomplete metamorphosis, which is where there's no pupa and it just kind of molts. And that's what we see happening in the marine environment more. We don't have this structure that the organism sits in and then more changes into the adult. We have more of a fluid kind of process through metamorphosis. They have a modular body plan. So it tends to be a head and a thorax or a cephalothorax in some of these organisms, and then an abdomen, but they all will have some form of a jointed appendage, which is going to have that hinge, referred to that kind of hinge. The phylum Echinodermata is the last of our invertebrates, and this is going to be Echinoderms, which is sea stars, sand dollars, and sea urchins. The word echino refers to the phrase spiny, and derm translates to skin, so they're spiny skins. And they have something called a couple interesting characteristics. They have a water vascular system, which is where they have water-filled canals that extend the little tube feet they have along the bottom. So water helps them with movement, but also with circulating materials within their body. The other thing that's really important about their water vascular system is by not having any blood and just sucking in water through something called a madreporite or a mother pore along the top. It's actually this little guy here, boop, right there. By sucking in water and drawing that in and using that as the circulating fluid within your body, it allows for them to have an abundance of gas exchange without having to get that gas into the blood system, which is something that we find organisms like fish and us need to do. They also are able to regenerate their arms, so they have specialized cells that are similar to stem cells, which are located at the base of these arms and along these arms, and such that if it got cut off, then it can regenerate and create any of the structures that are found or that are needed in order to complete that arm. So it's a pretty interesting feature of these organisms. So that's a little bit about the diversity of invertebrates, and hopefully you've enjoyed this presentation.